Nick Hollister stared at the crumpled deed in his weathered hands. $2. That's all it took to own an entire town. But something was wrong with this place. The buildings stood intact. The wells still held water, and yet not a single soul had lived here for over a decade. Copper, his stubborn donkey, refused to drink from the main well. Instead, the animal kept returning to the same patch of earth behind the old bank, pawing at the ground with an urgency Nick had never seen before. The strangest part? Every morning Nick found fresh footprints in the dust around that exact spot, footprints that weren't his. Footprints that appeared overnight, even though he was the only person for 50 miles in any direction. Rufus Garrett, the man who sold him the town, had mentioned something odd before disappearing. That place chooses its own owners. Nick thought it was just an old man's rambling. But now, watching Copper dig frantically at the same location for the third straight day, he was beginning to understand that some secrets don't stay buried just because people want them to. What Nick didn't know was that someone had been watching him since the moment he arrived. Someone who knew exactly why Copper was digging. Someone who had been waiting for this moment for years. Nick knelt beside the hole Copper had carved out with his hooves. The earth here felt different, softer, as if it had been disturbed before. As he brushed away loose dirt, his fingers caught something hard beneath the surface. Not rock, not root, not something smooth and artificial. He pulled out a small metal cylinder, no bigger than his thumb. It was tarnished with age, but clearly man-made. Inside, he could hear something rattling. Before he could examine it further, Copper's ears shot up, rotating toward the main street like compass needles pointing north. Nick heard it too. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses approaching fast. He shoved the cylinder into his vest pocket just as 3 riders crested the hill overlooking the town. They wore dark coats despite the heat, and their faces were shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. The lead rider raised his hand, and the group stopped at the town's edge, studying Nick with the intensity of hawks watching prey. Nick's mouth went dry. He had told no one about buying this place. The deed wasn't even recorded yet. So how had these men found him? And more importantly, what did they want in a town that had been abandoned for a decade? The lead rider spurred his horse forward, walking it slowly down the main street. His eyes never left Nick, but there was something else in his gaze. Recognition, as if he had been expecting to find Nick here all along. Copper backed away from the hole, his body tense with alarm. The donkey had never acted afraid of strangers before, but these weren't ordinary travelers passing through. These men had come here for a reason, and that reason was buried in the ground where Copper had been digging. The lead rider dismounted 50 feet away, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate weight. He was younger than Nick had expected, maybe 35, with cold gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the scene before him. "You're Nick Hollister," the man said. It wasn't a question. Nick's hand instinctively moved to his hip, but he carried no weapon. He had never needed one out here. Until now. "I am. And you're trespassing on my property." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your property, right. Because old Rufus sold it to you for $2. He took a step closer. "Tell me, Mr. Hollister, did he mention why the price was so low? Land's worthless out here. Nothing but dust and empty buildings. Is that so?" The stranger's gaze shifted to the hole behind Nick, then to Copper, who was still backing away from the approaching horses. "Then what's your animal digging for?" Nick felt the weight of the metal cylinder in his vest pocket. Whatever was inside that small tube, these men knew about it. They had come here specifically because of what lay buried beneath his feet. "Water," Nick lied smoothly. "Donkeys have good instincts for finding water." The man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Water, of course." He gestured to his companions, and they began to spread out, flanking Nick on both sides. "My name is Sterling Maddox. I represent certain interests that have a claim on this land. I have the deed right here." Nick pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket. "Legal and binding." "Oh, I'm not questioning your legal ownership," Sterling said, still advancing. "I'm questioning whether you understand what you actually bought." He stopped just 10 feet away now, close enough that Nick could see the calculating intelligence in his eyes. "This town wasn't abandoned because the silver ran out, Mr. Hollister. It was abandoned because of what they found down there." He pointed directly at the hole Copper had been digging. "People have been looking for what's buried here for 12 years. Wars have been fought over less valuable prizes. And you stumbled onto it because your donkey likes to dig holes." The cylinder in Nick's pocket seemed to grow heavier. Whatever was rattling around inside that small metal tube, it was connected to something much larger. Something worth enough to bring armed men to the middle of nowhere. "I don't know what you're talking about," Nick said. Sterling's smile widened. "Then you won't mind if we take a look at what you found." The two other riders had positioned themselves to cut off any escape route. Their hands rested casually on their gun handles, ready but not yet threatening. They were professionals, Nick realized. This wasn't their first time cornering someone, but something was still bothering him. If these men knew about the buried treasure, why hadn't they claimed this land years ago? Why wait for a stranger to buy it first? The answer came to him with chilling clarity. They needed someone else to find it. Someone expendable. Someone like him. Nick's mind raced as he weighed his options. 3 armed men against 1 unarmed rancher didn't offer favorable odds. But he had one advantage they didn't know about. He had already found something. "All right," he said, raising his hands in apparent surrender. "You want to see what my donkey dug up? Be my guest." Sterling motioned to his men, who approached the hole with practiced efficiency. The first rider knelt and began sifting through the loose dirt with his bare hands. After several minutes, he looked up and shook his head. "Nothing here but rocks and roots." Sterling's eyes narrowed dangerously. "That's impossible. The map clearly shows." He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but Nick had heard enough. A map. They had a map that led them to this exact spot. "Maybe your information is wrong," Nick suggested, trying to keep his voice steady. "My information," Sterling said slowly, "cost me 5 years and 3 men's lives to acquire. It is not wrong." He studied Nick's face with the intensity of a man reading a poker hand. "Strip him down. Check his pockets." The 2 riders moved toward Nick, but Copper suddenly brayed loudly and bolted toward the main street. All 3 men instinctively turned to watch the fleeing animal, and Nick seized the moment. He dove behind the old bank's water trough, his hand closing around a broken piece of wood that might serve as a weapon. "Find the donkey!" Sterling shouted. "If the old man trained it like he trained the others, it knows where everything is hidden." Others. There had been other donkeys, other people who had tried to uncover this secret. From his cover behind the trough, Nick could hear the men mounting their horses to chase Copper. This was his chance. He pulled the metal cylinder from his vest and tried to pry it open. The cap was corroded shut, but after several attempts it finally gave way. Inside was a rolled piece of paper, yellowed with age but still legible. Nick unfolded it carefully and found himself looking at a hand-drawn diagram. It showed the town from above, with various buildings marked and numbered. But it was the notation at the bottom that made his blood run cold. Federal Reserve Transfer, September 12, 1893, $200,000 in gold certificates. Emergency burial location pending railroad completion. Physical gold bars stored on-site pending transport. $200 million. In 1893, that would have been enough to buy half the territory. And unlike paper certificates, the actual gold bars would still be here, buried beneath his feet. The sound of returning hoofbeats broke his concentration. Sterling and his men were coming back, and they had Copper with them. The donkey was roped and being led behind Sterling's horse, his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Hollister," Sterling called out, his voice carrying across the empty street. "I have something that belongs to you, and I believe you have something that belongs to me." Nick folded the paper and slipped it back into the cylinder. He had 2 choices: surrender the map and hope Sterling let him live, or find a way to escape and claim the treasure for himself. But as he watched Sterling's men spread out to surround his hiding place, he realized there might be a third option, one that would require him to do something he had never done in his 52 years of life, something that would make him as dangerous as the men hunting him. Nick made his decision. He wasn't going to hide anymore. Standing up from behind the water trough, he walked into the open street with his hands visible, but empty. Sterling watched him approach with cautious interest, one hand resting on his gun, while the other held Copper's lead rope. "I'll make you a deal," Nick called out when he was 20 feet away. "I'll tell you exactly what I found and you let me and my donkey leave peacefully." Sterling laughed. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Mr. Hollister." "Actually, I think I am." Nick pulled out the metal cylinder and held it up. "Because what I found explains why Rufus Garrett was so eager to get rid of this place. And why you've been looking for it for 5 years. The laughter died in Sterling's throat. His gray eyes locked onto the cylinder with laser focus. "You see," Nick continued, I spent 20 years working for the railroad before I became a rancher. I know what federal transfer stations look like. This whole town was built as a temporary depot in 1893 when the government was moving gold reserves west during the bank panic. Sterling's horse shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing his rider's tension. The railroad was supposed to run through here, Nick went on, but the route changed at the last minute. The gold shipment got stranded, so they buried it and marked the location on this map. He tapped the cylinder. Your map only showed you where to dig. Mine shows you what you're looking for and how much of it there is. How much? Sterling asked, his voice barely above a whisper. $200 million in gold certificates. One of Sterling's men whistled low under his breath. Even in 1893, money, that was a fortune beyond imagining. Here's what happened, Nick continued. The government agents who buried it got killed in an Apache raid before they could report the exact location. The railroad moved the official depot 50 miles south, and this town was abandoned. Everyone forgot about the gold except for a few old-timers who passed down stories. Like Rufus Garrett, Sterling said. Like Rufus Garrett. But he was smart enough to know that if he started digging himself, he'd attract attention from men like you. So he waited for a sucker to buy the land and do the work for him. Sterling's eyes narrowed. And what makes you think you're not still that sucker? Nick smiled for the first time since this confrontation began. Because I'm not planning to dig it up. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind whistling through the empty buildings. What do you mean? Sterling demanded. I mean the gold certificates are worthless now. They expired in 1933 when Roosevelt took the country off the gold standard. What you're looking for is 40-year-old paper that no bank in the world would honor. Sterling's face went pale. That's impossible. We verified the authenticity of certificates that were valid 60 years ago, Nick finished. The question is, are you going to kill me over worthless paper? Or are you going to let me walk away from the biggest waste of time in treasure hunting history? But even as he spoke, Nick noticed something in Sterling's expression. The man didn't look defeated. He looked like someone who knew something Nick didn't. Mr. Hollister, Sterling said with a cold smile, you clearly don't understand what gold certificates really are. Sterling's cold smile sent a chill down Nick's spine. The man was too confident for someone whose treasure hunt had just been declared worthless. You want to know what gold certificates really are? Mr. Hollister? Sterling asked, dismounting from his horse. They're not just paper promises. Each certificate represents actual gold bars stored in federal vaults. Gold that doesn't expire. Gold that's worth more today than it was in 1893. Nick felt his certainty crumble. But the certificates themselves are still valid if you know the right people, Sterling interrupted. Private collectors, foreign banks, certain government officials who understand the value of discretion. 200 million in 1893 gold. In today's market, that's worth over $3 billion. The number hit Nick like a physical blow. $3 billion. No wonder men had died searching for this treasure. Now I'm going to ask you one more time, Sterling said, his hand moving to his gun. Where exactly did you find that cylinder? Before Nick could answer, one of Sterling's men called out from near the bank building. Boss, come look at this. Sterling kept his eyes on Nick but shouted back. What is it? Fresh campfire ashes. Maybe 3 days old. Someone's been watching this place. Nick's mind raced back to those mysterious footprints he had found each morning. Now it made sense. Sterling's men had been here before, probably watching and waiting for him to make the discovery they couldn't risk making themselves. You've been spying on me, Nick said. Sterling shrugged. We've been monitoring the property since Rufus put it up for sale. Had to make sure whoever bought it would actually dig. Most people would have just used it for grazing land. But you needed someone else to find it first. Insurance, Sterling explained. If government agents were still monitoring this area, they'd investigate any large-scale excavation. But a new landowner with a curious donkey? That's just natural behavior. The pieces were falling into place now. Copper hadn't been acting on instinct when he repeatedly returned to that spot behind the bank. The donkey had been responding to scents and sounds that Nick hadn't noticed. The lingering presence of men who had been camping nearby, watching, waiting. Your animal's smarter than you gave him credit for, Sterling continued. He could smell us from the moment you arrived. That's why he wouldn't drink from the main well. We'd been using it to water our horses. Nick glanced at Copper, who was still roped to Sterling's saddle but watching everything with alert eyes. The donkey had been trying to warn him all along, in the only way an animal could. So what happens now? Nick asked. Now you're going to show us exactly where you found that cylinder, Sterling said, and then you're going to help us dig up the rest. What makes you think there's more? Sterling pulled out a folded paper from his coat, another map, more detailed than the one in Nick's cylinder. Because according to our research, what you found was just the location marker. The actual gold vault is 30 feet deeper. Nick's heart sank. He wasn't holding the treasure map after all. He was holding the equivalent of a signpost that said, "Dig here." Nick stared at Sterling's detailed map, his mind racing. The document looked official, complete with government seals and surveyor markings. It showed the entire underground layout of what had been a temporary federal depot, including multiple burial sites. "Where did you get this?" Nick asked. "Cost me 2 men and 5 years of my life," Sterling replied grimly. "Turns out one of the original government agents survived that Apache raid. Spent 40 years in an asylum, babbling about buried gold. Most people thought he was crazy, but you believed him. I believed the scars on his back and the federal identification papers sewn into his jacket lining." Sterling folded the map carefully. He drew this from memory 3 days before he died. One of Sterling's men approached, leading 2 horses loaded with digging equipment, shovels, pickaxes, and rope. They had come prepared for major excavation work. "Here's how this works," Sterling said to Nick. "You help us dig, and when we're done, you get to walk away with your life and your donkey. Refuse and we'll bury you in the same hole we're about to open." Nick looked around the empty town. No witnesses, no help coming, and 3 armed men who clearly meant business. But something still bothered him about this whole situation. If you had the location all along, why wait for someone to buy the property? Why not just come out here and dig? Sterling's jaw tightened. Because we weren't the only ones looking. Federal marshals have been monitoring land sales in this area for decades. Too much government activity here in 1893 for them to ignore completely. So you needed cover. We needed someone with a legitimate reason to be here. A new landowner clearing his property, maybe looking for a good spot for a well. Sterling gestured toward the hole Copper had started. But now that you found the marker, the hard part is over. Nick's mind worked furiously. If federal marshals were still monitoring the area, that meant help might be coming. All he had to do was delay the excavation long enough for someone to notice the unusual activity. "This is going to take days," Nick said, studying the map. "According to this, you're talking about a shaft 30 feet deep and 12 feet wide. 3 men with shovels? You'll be here for a week." Sterling smiled coldly. "Who said anything about 3 men?" He put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled sharply. From behind buildings all around the town, more men emerged. Nick counted 8 riders, all armed, all carrying digging tools. Sterling hadn't just brought muscle, he had brought a complete excavation crew. "We've been planning this for months, Mr. Hollister. The only variable was finding someone foolish enough to buy this land and start digging in the right place." Nick watched the men begin organizing their equipment and setting up what looked like a mining camp. This wasn't going to be a quick treasure hunt. Sterling was preparing for a major operation, but that gave Nick an idea. A dangerous idea, but maybe his only chance of survival. If Sterling needed days to complete the excavation, Nick had days to find a way to escape. Or better yet, find a way to claim the treasure for himself. Nick spent the first day watching Sterling's men work, memorizing their routines and looking for weaknesses. By sunset, they had dug down 15 feet and found nothing but soil and rocks. Sterling was getting impatient. "Maybe your map is wrong," Nick suggested during their evening meal around the campfire. "The map is accurate," Sterling snapped. "We just haven't gone deep enough." That night, while the men slept in shifts with guards posted, Nick made his move. He had 20 years of railroad experience, and he knew marshal patrols followed predictable routes along old territorial boundaries. Working silently, he led Copper to the highest point overlooking the town, the old water tower. Using pieces of broken mirror from abandoned buildings in the morning sun, he created a series of light flashes in the pattern railroad workers used for emergency signals. The reflection would be visible for miles to anyone traveling the main territorial road. His message was simple but effective. 3 long flashes, 3 short, 3 long. The universal distress signal, repeated toward the direction of the nearest marshal station. He maintained the signal for an hour at dawn, then carefully returned to camp before Sterling's men noticed his absence. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Sterling's men had broken through to a wooden crate buried exactly 30 feet down. Inside were not gold certificates, but something far more valuable. Actual gold bars, each one stamped with Federal Reserve markings and dates from 1893. "This is just the first cache," Sterling said, his eyes gleaming with greed. "According to the map, there are 6 more burial sites around the town." Nick watched the men celebrate and realized his telegram might have come too late. If Sterling found all 6 caches before help arrived, they would disappear with billions of dollars in gold. But then he heard something that changed his perspective entirely. The distant sound of horses approaching from the east. Multiple riders moving fast. Sterling heard it too. "Everyone grab your weapons," he ordered. Could be more treasure hunters. Nick counted the riders as they crested the hill. 12 men wearing territorial marshal badges, led by a man in a black coat who carried himself with unmistakable authority. "Federal marshals," Nick said quietly. Sterling's face went pale. "How did they find us?" "Same way you found me," Nick replied. "They've been watching this place for decades, waiting for someone to start digging." It was a lie, but Sterling didn't need to know about the mirror signals. The marshals surrounded the town within minutes, their rifles trained on Sterling's crew. The leader, a grizzled man with iron-gray hair, rode forward. "This is Marshal Thompson. You men are in violation of federal law by excavating government property without authorization." Sterling raised his hand slowly. "We have a legal claim to this land. Bill of sale right here." "Your claim ended when you dug up federal gold reserves," Thompson replied. "That makes this a federal case." Nick smiled as he watched Sterling's grand plan crumble. But his satisfaction was short-lived when Marshal Thompson turned his attention to him. "And you, Mr. Hollister, are under arrest for theft of government property." Nick looked Marshal Thompson straight in the eye. "I'm not a thief, Marshal. I'm the man who sent the mirror signal that brought you here." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "You sent the distress signal?" "Yesterday at dawn, using broken mirrors to flash sunlight from the water tower. Old railroad emergency technique. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long flashes toward your patrol route." Sterling's mouth fell open. "You signaled the marshals?" "I signaled them," Nick confirmed, "because I realize this gold doesn't belong to any of us. It belongs to the American people." Marshal Thompson studied Nick's face carefully. "You could have disappeared with that first gold bar and lived comfortably for the rest of your life." "Maybe," Nick admitted, "but I've spent 52 years doing the honest thing, and I wasn't about to stop now." The marshal nodded slowly, then turned to his men. "Arrest Sterling and his crew for federal theft and armed conspiracy. Get those gold bars loaded into our wagons." As Sterling was led away in shackles, he glared at Nick with pure hatred. "You threw away $3 billion, you fool." "I threw away a life of looking over my shoulder," Nick replied. Marshal Thompson remained behind after his men had secured the site. "Mr. Hollister, the federal government recognizes that you acted in good faith and provided valuable assistance in recovering stolen property. What does that mean?" "It means you keep your $2 town, free and clear. It also means there's a federal reward for recovery of stolen gold reserves, 5% of the total value." Nick's mind raced. 5% of $3 billion. That's $150 million, Thompson continued. More money than most men see in 10 lifetimes. Nick looked around the empty town that had changed his life so completely. "What happens to this place?" "That's up to you. It's your land. Legally purchased. The government has no claim on the property itself, only on the gold that was buried here." Nick patted Copper's neck, thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he was a broke rancher with nothing but a stubborn donkey. Now he was one of the wealthiest men in the territory. "Marshal," he said finally, "I want to turn this place into something useful. Maybe a way station for travelers, or a school for children who don't have access to proper education." Thompson smiled. "With $150 million, Mr. Hollister, you can build whatever you want." As the marshal rode away with his prisoners and the recovered gold, Nick stood in the middle of the dusty street with Copper beside him. The town was quiet again, but it felt different now. Not empty, but full of possibilities. He pulled out the original deed, crumpled, stained, but still legal, and smoothed it carefully. $2 had bought him a ghost town, but courage, honesty, and a little bit of luck had bought him a future he never could have imagined. Nick Hollister was no longer the desperate man who had stumbled onto this place looking for a new start. He was a man who had faced danger, made hard choices, and emerged with both his integrity and his life intact. And that, he realized, was worth more than all the buried gold in the world. If you enjoyed this story, Click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.